Welcome back. Yesterday we were talking about photosynthesis, which is how plants convert that sunlight. They use that heat from the sun and that water from the roots and the earth and the air. And there's an air exchange. They breathe in this carbon dioxide, which is the air we breathe out, and they breathe out nice, fresh oxygen that we breathe in. And that is the photosynthesis process. They make carbohydrate. They make those simple sugars. Sugars are those carbohydrate. And you notice that they're breathing in carbon dioxide and they're producing carbohydrate. And carbon dioxide is carbon and oxygen, two oxygens, oxide. And they're breathing out the oxygen and they're keeping the carbon. We'll learn more about that later. Today, we're going to talk about respiration in plants. Now, there's respiration in people because we breathe. And the way that we breathe, you can actually feel because you're a person. So you can, as many times I've asked you throughout the year, you can put your hand over your chest, over your stomach. You can feel your belly rise. You can feel your belly fall. If you're breathing too shallow, you can feel your shoulders rise. You can feel your shoulders fall. And when you exercise, when you work your body, when you work your muscles, if you start going for a run, what's going to happen? You're going to start breathing harder. Why are you going to start breathing harder? Because for all these really complex little functions of your muscles and all the cells inside your muscles, you need oxygen. It's going to burn that oxygen. And so your body needs more oxygen, so you breathe harder and you breathe in more oxygen so that your body can perform those vital functions. Well, it's the same thing with plants. So we tend to think that plants just breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen all the time. Well, there's an opposite process that plants have from when they're making that sugar and they're going through the photosynthesis process and they're being photosynthetic. There's an opposite process, and that's respiration. Now, plants go through respiration throughout the day, but they also go through respiration throughout the night, which is to say they breathe through the day and they breathe through the night. And plants don't just breathe through their leaves like most people think. Plants also breathe through their roots. That's right. So plants are breathing all the time. You can actually drown a plant if you give it too much water. Your nice house plant that's sitting in a receptacle, in a bowl, in a bucket, in a jar, in a clay pot, wherever your plant is, you can actually drown that plant by giving it too much water. The plant needs to breathe through its roots. Now, plants can, well, land plants can breathe oxygen out of water. Some. They breathe better if it's just pockets of air. So they need air pockets in the soil. So you can't just have a plant in a block of clay where it can't breathe. That's another way that you can suffocate your plant. There needs to be pockets of air for those roots to breathe. So you need there to be tiny little holes throughout the soil in your plant. That's called porous. Porous is like looking at a sponge where you see that there's a bunch of holes and it can actually absorb a bunch of water, and when you squeeze it, it's going to squeeze out a bunch of water. So you want soil like that, spongy, porous soil. So most of the plant's breathing is going to take place through its leaves. And it's going to breathe fairly shallow. So during the daytime, it is going to give off a significant amount more oxygen than it needs to take in oxygen. But it's also going to breathe in a little bit of oxygen because it needs that oxygen to have certain muscles work, which is that it needs to actually eat its own food that it's making. It's not just making the sugars in the plant out of the kindness of its heart for animals and for people. It's making that sugar so that it can feed itself, so that it can continue to make more plants. So plants are pretty wonderful in that way. They make food for everyone, including themselves. When they eat their own food, they need to breathe. They actually need a little bit of oxygen to go through that process of eating their own sugar. So what's the point of breathing in carbon dioxide and spitting out oxygen if you only need to breathe in more oxygen and spit out some carbon dioxide? Well, they actually significantly produce much more oxygen than they do carbon dioxide. So during the nighttime, a plant is going to breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, but it's not that much. They're doing all the heavy lifting, they're doing all that hard work during the daytime, and plants are going to go through that process of photosynthesis during the day, but then there's no photosynthesis at night. And I imagine that you can guess why there's not photosynthesis going on at night. I'll give you a moment to think about it. They take in the water, and they take in the carbon dioxide, and they take in the sunlight, and they breathe out the oxygen through that cellular respiration and through their plant respiration, and they store those sugars. All right, well, if you figured it out, it's because plants need that sunlight for photosynthesis. And when there's no light for photosynthesis, they stop photosynthesizing. So right around dawn and right around dusk, when the sun is just barely up, the plants don't do much photosynthesis at all. They're just kind of at a break-even point where they're going through just a little bit of cellular respiration. They're breathing in just a little bit, they're breathing out just a little bit, they're creating as much oxygen as they are using. And so they're right at a break-even point. During the night, they're going to use a little bit more oxygen, but during the day, they're going to create significantly more, much more oxygen. And they're going to take in a lot more carbon dioxide. That's the air that we breathe out. And in a way, people don't exactly do this, but people kind of do this too. I mean, if you think about it, you don't breathe in only oxygen. If you're in a room, or if you're in a car, or even just out in nature, you're going to breathe out your carbon dioxide. And when you breathe back in, you're probably going to breathe back in a little bit of your own carbon dioxide, maybe somebody else's carbon dioxide. That's why it's always nice to have a nice window open so that you can clear your head and get more oxygen and have the ability to breathe in fresher, cleaner air, get more oxygen to your blood, get more oxygen to the rest of your body without taking more breaths. It's a nice little life hack right there. So, how do plants breathe in? They don't have mouths, right? Or do they? Well, actually, there's a Greek word, stoma, which means mouth, and plants have stomata, which are tiny mouths. And if you look really closely at plants, at the leaves, at some of the roots, they have these stomata, like these tiny little mouths that actually do sort of breathe in. Now, they don't have lungs, and so that they're not going to breathe in through lungs like what they're going to do is they're actually just going to breathe in by a process called diffusion. And this is actually the same as with roots and that turgor pressure and the thing that I said I wasn't going to get into until we talked about physics, which is they're going to take where there's a lot of air, and diffusion means it's going to transfer to where there's less air. So if they just open their mouths and there's a little bit of space there, that space is going to take in air. And that is how a plant is going to breathe. Just like if there's water, if there's a whole bunch of water in the roots and there's less water up at the top of the plant, well, diffusion is going to want to diffuse, to push, to pull that water from the bottom of the plant up to the top. Likewise, it's just going to pull that air from the outside of the plant to the inside of the plant. So there you go. Plants do have tiny little mouths all over the place. There's little stomata. And there's one more thing. I know we've talked about a few things already, and it's nice to keep it simple. But they also want to protect those little mouths. And so most leaves on plants have a waxy cuticle. This waxy cuticle is literally just kind of like a layer of wax that the plant makes to protect the plant from breathing in too much air or breathing out too much air. And this is really essential for plants anywhere, especially in those hot, dry environments where there's a lot of heat would just suck the moisture right out of the plant if they weren't able to protect themselves. And so you see a thick skin and a thick waxy cuticle on those plants in drier places. Now in rainforest, you're going to see that a little bit less because there's water transfer all the time. There's very humid air, which means that the air is filled with all kinds of water droplets. And when the plant is breathing in, it's not going to dry out so much as it would in a hotter, drier environment, although it can be pretty hot and dry in rainforest as well. So you're going to see this waxy cuticle on the top of a leaf, a thick layer protecting the leaf from drying up, protecting that from having too much diffusion, from it having too much cellular respiration and breathing in and out too much air. So that's how a plant is able to protect itself. And some plants are really quite wonderful at that, and some are not. And the ones that are not tend to die out, because if you're not able to protect yourself in the pretty harsh wild of nature, if you're a plant or an animal, then chances are the thing that is able to protect itself better will take your place, and their kids will take your kids' place. Another way of thinking about a cuticle is if you look down at your fingernails, you actually have kind of a thick sort of it looks like that waxy covering of the plant, but it's actually like a tiny little piece of skin. You have the cuticle over your fingernail, where your fingernails meet your skin so that they don't just pop off. They're being covered by that cuticle, which is kind of holding them in place and giving them a sticky little covering, so that you can't just slide your fingernails in and out, which would be probably incredibly painful unless we were adapted to it. And that's it. You look at this cross section of a leaf, and we've gone over the basic processes so far that are inside of leaves. Is that you have this stem that's going to be able to transport things up and down through the vascular system, through these tubes, these tubules coming up and down through the stem. You've got these openings or nodes, which are really strong, reinforced places where the plant shoots out something like a thorn or a branch or a bud or a needle or something like that. Then you go over to the leaf. Either you come through the branch, or maybe the leaf is right there at one of the nodes. And again, those little tubules or microtubules, these little teeny things that are transporting sap, the xylem and phloem, up and down the plant, are going to take it out to the leaf. And once it's out at the leaf, in those cells of the leaf, there's these little chloroplasts where the chlorophyll is, and that's going to be involved in the process of taking in sunlight. And then these little stomata that are on the leaf are going to practice diffusion of cellular respiration. They're going to breathe in and out air. They're going to try to, in the daytime, take in more carbon dioxide, and in the nighttime they'll probably take in a little bit more oxygen. But these things are breathing, and then when that meets, when you have all those things meet together, that's when that magical process occurs. That's when it's going to make sugar. It's going to make carbohydrate. Is when you have that water flowing up, when you have that sunlight shining down, when you have that air going in. And it's actually not that different from the very first day when I said it was, like these four elements. You had earth, water, fire, and air, and they all meet and they make this magic. They make this carbohydrate, which is that basic building block that we're all going to take in for us to live. So plants don't just make our air that we breathe, they also make all that food that we eat, and they do it every day, all day, every day. They do it at night. They're sitting there converting those sugars and breathing in and having this magical process. So for that, we can be very grateful. We can say, hey, plants, thanks for doing all the hard work for us so that we don't have to do our own photosynthesis and cellular respiration of trying to photosynthesize sunlight. You did that for us. Humans are their own complex beast, and we'll go over that in a few years. Thank you so much for tuning in today for cellular respiration, and I will see you tomorrow, Friday, and we will talk about something really fun, one of my favorite parts of this whole block. I will see you tomorrow.